Hello class, and welcome to our next video lesson. Before we get into the content, I want to pose a question to you. Have you ever wondered why your body becomes warm from standing near a fire, or why does ice begin to melt as you hold it in your hand? This everyday phenomenon can be described by our next topic of study, which is heat transfer. Heat transfer is simply the movement of thermal energy from one substance to another, and these substances are typically at different temperatures. Heat is going to travel from the warmer substance to the cooler substance. This transfer of heat is going to continue until both substances are at the same temperature. There are three ways that heat is transferred, and they are conduction, convection, and radiation. In this lesson, we're going to talk about all three types of heat transfer, and we're also going to relate that to the molecules that make up these different substances in which heat is being transferred from and to. Let's first talk about conduction. Conduction occurs when the particles in a neighboring material collide with each other. When particles and materials collide with neighboring particles. In other words, conduction occurs whenever objects are in direct contact. If you have two objects at different temperatures, and they're touching, then heat will be transferred by what we call conduction. It's going to occur most easily in your solids and liquids because this is where the atoms and the molecules are closer together. And since they are closer together in solids and liquids, it is much easier for the heat to jump from particle to particle if those objects are in direct contact. Some examples of conduction would be an ice cube melting in your hand. The ice cube in your hand are touching or what we would call making direct contact. Your hand is the warmer substance in this scenario, so your hand would transfer heat to the ice cube, causing it to melt. A spoon becoming warm from sitting in hot soup is another good example. The soup is the warmer substance, so the soup is going to transfer heat to the spoon, and eventually they would be at the same temperature. Convection. Convection will occur when thermal energy is transferred by the movement of atoms or molecules from one part of a material to another. So whenever convection occurs, it's going to involve the movement of atoms and molecules. So therefore, convection is going to occur most easily in your liquids and gases where particles or molecules have the space to move around more easily than they would in a solid. Let's look at some examples of convection. Convection can kind of sometimes be the one that can be a little bit confusing, but let's look at two good examples of how convection would occur. Whenever you turn the heater on in a room, typically the warmer air is going to be towards the ceiling and the cooler air is towards the floor. This circulation of air is what we would call convection because you've got heat being transferred to the air in the room and it causes those particles to move around. The warmer ones will rise and the cooler ones will sink. The warmer ones rise because they're less dense, and then the cooler ones will sink because they're more dense. That's the same thing that happens when you boil water. You will have a circulation of water with the warmer water rising and the cooler water sinking. This circulation will continue until all of the water is at the same temperature. And this is what we would call convection. Okay? Moving on. Radiation. Radiation is going to occur whenever thermal energy is transferred by what we call electromagnetic waves. In our last video lesson, we talked about something called electromagnetic energy, which is energy that is carried through empty space. Some examples of some electromagnetic energy might be something like light or infrared, X-rays. All of those would be examples of what we would call electromagnetic energy. Well, whenever heat is transferred by these types of waves, then that is what we would call radiation. Now, the thing about radiation is when it occurs, heat can be transferred from one object to another without the objects even being real close to each other. For example, when we're standing here on Earth and we become warm from the sun, that is what we would call radiation. And the sun is thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from us, but we're still able to feel its warmth because of those electromagnetic waves, which is how that heat eventually reaches the Earth's surface. Another good example would be standing in front of a fire and warming my hands, like we mentioned in the very first slide. That would also be an example of radiation. I don't have to come extremely close to the fire. I don't have to touch the fire. If I come near the fire, then that heat is going to be transferred by those electromagnetic waves, which would cause my body to feel the warmth. And radiation can happen in empty space where there's no air. It can also happen in your solids, liquids, and in your gases. So radiation is kind of like the most common type of heat transfer that we experience because it can happen in many different scenarios and different ways. This concludes the end of our video lesson. Please make sure that you have completed your graphic organizer and you have all the information for these 3 different types of heat transfer.